No one believed what the widow found under the barn on July 4th, 2026. The morning of July 4th, before the flags went up on Main Street, and before the fireworks stand outside Marrows Creek opened its plywood shutters, a 62-year-old widow drove an iron crowbar into a rotted plank of her barn floor, and Kentucky opened beneath her boots like a secret that had been holding its breath for 30 years. What she pulled out from under those boards was not gold. It was something that would either save her family's land by nightfall or bury her husband's name forever. By the time the fireworks lit the sky over the county square, half the town would be crying in the street, and the other half would be demanding to know why nobody had told them the truth sooner. Before we go further, picture this: a locked trapdoor under a collapsing barn floor, 40 leather-bound diaries, a lame old Clydesdale horse named Old Glory who refuses to lie down and die, even when everyone tells him he should, and a land developer smiling at a funeral anniversary while doing math in his head. If a stranger showed up at your door offering to erase your debts in exchange for burning your late husband's handwriting, would you take the money, or would you protect a truth nobody asked you to carry? Type your city in the comments before you keep watching. Hit like if old barns hide better secrets than banks, and subscribe if you want to see how far a widow in Kentucky will go to keep a promise her husband never spoke out loud. Now, let's go back to that morning. Kentucky bluegrass does not ask permission before it turns brown. By late June, the pastures around Colby Farm had gone the color of old rope, cracked and brittle under a sun that refused to let up. The fences that once ran white and proud along the property line had faded into a tired gray, chipped in long strips where the paint had simply given up. Some of the posts leaned like old men resting on canes. Nobody had touched them in over a year. Jeanette Colby moved through this landscape the way a person moves through a house after the funeral guests have gone home and the casseroles have run out. Steady, practical, alone. She was 62 years old, with hands that told a different story than her face, knuckles swollen from decades of rope burn and fence wire, palms calloused into something closer to leather than skin. She wore her husband's old canvas jacket even in the heat of a Kentucky July. Not out of sentiment she would admit to anyone, but because the sleeves still smelled faintly of him if she buried her nose in the collar fast enough, before the barn air and diesel fumes swallowed it whole. 1 year. That was the number that sat behind her ribs like a stone she carried without setting down. Walter Colby had died on the 4th of July, 1 year ago to the day, standing in this same yard, his heart giving out between the porch steps and the mailbox while she was inside washing dishes and humming along to a radio she could no longer bear to turn on. She had found him with the mail still gripped in his hand, a phone bill, a seed catalog, and underneath both, a letter from the county bank that she would not open for 3 more days, because some part of her already understood what it would say. What it said was ruin. Walter had always handled the money. It was an old arrangement between them, settled decades ago without much discussion. She ran the horses and the house. He ran the ledgers and the loans, and neither of them had ever felt the need to trade places. It had worked for 38 years of marriage. It stopped working the moment he stopped breathing, and Jeanette discovered, in the slow and humiliating unraveling that followed, that the farm had been drowning for longer than she wanted to believe. Late payments, refinanced notes, a second mortgage she never knew existed, taken out against land that had been in Walter's family since before the Second World War. She did not know how to read half the paperwork the bank sent her. She learned. She sat at the kitchen table some nights until 2 in the morning with a calculator and a legal pad, teaching herself the language of interest rates and grace periods, furious at herself for not learning it sooner, furious at Walter for never asking her to. There was a particular kind of grief in that, not just missing a husband, but discovering, piece by piece, that the man she had trusted completely might have known the ship was sinking and said nothing. Whether out of pride or shame or some private hope that he could fix it before she ever had to find out, she would never know. He had not left a note. He had not left an explanation. He had only left the farm, the horses, and the silence. Of the horses, only 4 remained. 3 were young enough to sell, if a buyer ever came looking, which they rarely did this far off the interstate. The 4th was Old Glory, a Clydesdale gelding pushing 26 years old, with a front leg that had never fully healed from an injury nobody quite remembered the cause of anymore. He had belonged to Walter longer than Jeanette had. He had pulled wagons in the county parade every summer for over a decade, mane braided with ribbon, hooves polished, drawing gasps from children who had never seen a horse that size up close. Now he stood most days in the shade of a leaning oak, weight shifted off the bad leg, watching the road with an attention that seemed almost deliberate, as if he were still waiting for someone who was not coming back. Jeanette fed him first every morning, before she fed herself. It was not sentiment, she told herself. It was practicality. An animal that size needed to eat regular, or the vet bills would climb faster than the debt already had. But she lingered at his stall longer than the task required, running a hand down his graying neck, saying nothing, because there was nothing left to say that the horse hadn't already heard 100 times. The barn behind the main house had been closed off for almost 2 years, ever since a section of its roof had caved under a bad ice storm, and Walter, already slowing down, already tired in a way she hadn't understood was more than age, had decided it wasn't worth the cost to repair. Old tools, old harness leather, broken wagon wheels stacked against a back wall nobody had touched. It had become, without either of them deciding it on purpose, a place where things went to be forgotten. On the morning of July 4th, 1 year to the day since she found her husband in the yard with the mail still in his hand, Jeanette Colby woke before dawn, made coffee she didn't drink, and decided she was not going to spend the day sitting on the porch waiting for the loneliness to arrive on schedule. She was going to clean out that barn, whether it needed doing or not, whether the heat was already climbing past 90 by 7 in the morning or not. She needed her hands busy and her mind somewhere other than the mailbox. She dressed in the dark, the way she had every morning since the funeral, moving through a routine so worn into her body that she no longer needed light to complete it. Jeans first, then the flannel shirt, then Walter's canvas jacket over the top of it. Even in a Kentucky July, even with the forecast already promising 94 degrees before noon. She caught herself at the mirror once, briefly, a woman she barely recognized some mornings, gray threading further through her hair each month, lines at the corners of her eyes that had less to do with age than with a year spent squinting into a future she could no longer predict. Outside, the county was already stirring in its own quiet way. A neighbor 2 properties down had strung red, white, and blue bunting along his porch rail the week before, visible from Jeanette's kitchen window if she leaned far enough to the left, a small cheerful reminder of a holiday she no longer felt any particular claim to. Somewhere further off, a dog barked at nothing, and a truck idled too long in a driveway before finally pulling away. The ordinary sounds of a town preparing to celebrate independence moved past her farm the way weather moves past a mountain, present but unable to change the shape of what stood in its way. She thought, more than once that morning, of simply not doing anything at all, of sitting on the porch with a glass of tea and letting the day pass the way the last year of anniversaries and birthdays and quiet Sundays had passed, endured rather than lived. But there was a particular exhaustion in mourning on a schedule, in knowing that grief would arrive precisely at dawn whether she invited it or not, and some stubborn part of her, the same part that had taught herself bank statements at 2 in the morning, the same part that had never once let a debt collector hear her voice shake, decided that if the day insisted on arriving, she would at least meet it with her hands full. She had no way of knowing that by sundown, the whole county would know her husband's name in a way none of them had ever expected. The barn door stuck the way it always had, swollen at the hinges from years of Kentucky humidity, and Jeanette threw her shoulder into it twice before it gave with a groan that sent a pair of barn swallows scattering into the gray morning light. Dust hung suspended in the air the barn let in, thick motes turning slow in the crack of sun through the broken roofline. The smell hit her first, old hay gone to rot, rusted metal, the particular mustiness of a space that has not been breathed into in a long time. She stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary. It was not the mess that stopped her. It was the sheer volume of Walter left behind in places she had not thought to look. A coiled length of harness rope hung on a nail exactly where he'd left it. A coffee can of bent nails sat on a workbench beside a claw hammer with his initials burned into the handle, a gift from his father decades before either of them were born into each other's lives. Everything in that barn had been arranged by a man who believed he would be coming back to arrange it further. She got to work before the grief could catch up to her. The plan was simple enough. Clear the collapsed section near the back wall, salvage what tools were still good, haul the rotten wood out to burn later in the week. She worked methodically, The way she worked everything now, stacking splintered boards into a pile by the door, sweating through Walter's old jacket within the hour, ignoring the ache building low in her back. Somewhere past 9, she noticed the load was heavier than she could manage alone. A long support beam, warped by water damage, wedged under a collapsed section of flooring near the northeast corner, too heavy to drag by hand, and too awkward to leverage with the crowbar alone. She thought of the tractor first. It had been sitting dead in the equipment shed for 3 weeks, a part on order from a dealership 2 counties over that hadn't arrived yet. One more small failure in a farm full of them. There was another option, and she stood in the barn doorway looking at it for a long moment before she let herself walk toward the oak tree. Old Glory raised his head when she approached, ears swiveling toward her the way they always did, as if her footsteps were a sound he'd cataloged separately from every other sound on the property. She ran a hand along his shoulder, feeling for the tension there, the old injury that still made him favor the left front leg on cold mornings and long days. It was the 4th of July. The heat was already brutal. Common sense said to leave the old horse in his shade and rent a come-along instead, or wait for a neighbor, or simply leave the beam where it lay and deal with it another week. She fitted the old work harness over him anyway, the leather stiff from disuse, buckling it with hands that remembered the motion even though it had been years since she'd asked this horse to pull anything heavier than his own weight. He stood patient through it, the way he'd stood patient through every harness of his life, and when she led him toward the barn, his gait was slower than it used to be, uneven, but willing. Dust hung heavy in the shaft of light between them, and for a moment the barn was silent except for the horse's breathing and the distant, muffled pop of an early firecracker somewhere down the county road, some neighbor's child getting an early start on the holiday. Jeanette checked the chain twice, running her thumb along each link the way Walter had taught her decades ago, back before either of them could have imagined a year like the one just passed. The old harness leather creaked with a familiar complaint as Old Glory shifted his weight, testing the unfamiliar pull of a job he hadn't been asked to do in years. It took 3 attempts to loop the chain around the beam correctly. On the 4th, she stepped back, gathered the lead line, and asked him forward. Old Glory leaned into the harness the way an animal leans into memory rather than instruction, muscle and bone remembering a job his body was no longer built for. The beam groaned. For a moment, nothing happened, just strain and dust sifting down from the rafters, and the horse's breath coming heavier than she liked to hear from an animal his age. Then the floor gave way. Not the whole floor. A section roughly 6 feet across, directly beneath where the beam had been wedged, folded downward with a splintering crack that sent Jeanette stumbling backward and Old Glory throwing his weight sideways, ears pinned, eyes wide. The chain slipped free from the collapsing wood. The horse was unhurt, though visibly rattled, sidestepping toward the open barn door with the particular alertness of a prey animal that has just heard the ground betray it. Jeanette's heart hammered against Walter's old jacket. She stood frozen for a breath, waiting to see if more of the floor intended to follow the first section down. And when it didn't, she approached the hole slowly, crowbar still gripped in one hand, less as a tool now than something to hold on to. Below the broken boards was not the dirt foundation she expected. It was a wooden hatch, roughly 4 feet square, set into a shallow dugout space beneath the barn floor, hinges rusted nearly solid, a heavy iron ring bolted to its center. It had clearly been built there on purpose, at some point long before either she or Walter had owned this land, or perhaps by Walter himself in the early years of their marriage, in a part of his life he had never once mentioned to her. She stood over it for a long time, the barn silent except for Old Glory's breathing behind her and the distant, thin sound of a truck passing on the county road. Whatever was down there had been waiting under her feet for years without her ever knowing it existed. She knelt, gripped the iron ring, and pulled. The hatch resisted for a long moment, rust and time fusing the hinges together, and then it gave all at once with a shriek of metal that startled another pair of birds from the rafters above. A breath of cool, dry air rose up from the space beneath, carrying the particular smell of old paper and leather that Jeanette would come to associate, in the days that followed, with the moment everything about her understanding of her marriage changed. She retrieved a flashlight from the truck, her hands unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the morning's labor, and returned to kneel at the edge of the opening. The space below was shallow, no more than 4 feet deep, dug into the earth and lined with old wooden crates and a row of metal storage boxes, the kind used decades ago to keep documents safe from moisture. She lowered herself down carefully, one boot finding solid ground, then the other, and swept the beam of light across what her husband had hidden beneath their barn for the entire length of their marriage. Diaries. Dozens of them, bound in cracked leather and cloth, stacked in careful rows inside the crates, each one numbered on the spine in Walter's own handwriting, a system of order that told her immediately this had not been an accident or a single moment of secrecy, but a project tended and organized across years. Beside the diaries, boxes of photographs, black and white bleeding slowly into faded color as she moved from crate to crate. Images of horses she did not recognize standing in pastures she did not know, some accompanied by names written in pencil along the white borders. Cross-reference folders held what looked like veterinary records, hand-drawn family trees not of people, but of animals, bloodlines traced back generations. Everything had been sealed against moisture with a care that spoke of long practice. Wax paper lined the bottoms of the crates. A small tin of silica packets, the kind used to protect film negatives, sat wedged into one corner, half dissolved with age, but still faintly doing its job. Whoever had built this space had not expected to fill it once and forget it. They had expected to return again and again, for years, adding one more diary, one more folder, one more photograph. Each visit a private ritual conducted in the dark beneath a barn floor, while a wife slept soundly in the house 40 yards away, certain she knew the whole of her husband's evenings. Jeanette found herself counting the diary spines without meaning to, the way a person counts stairs in the dark. 41. 41 years of a marriage that had lasted 38, which meant Walter had begun this work before she had even met him, had carried it forward silently through their courtship, their wedding, the birth and loss of a child neither of them spoke of anymore, through every ordinary Tuesday of a life she had believed, until this exact moment. She understood completely. She sat down hard on the dirt floor of the hidden space, flashlight beam wavering against the low ceiling, and opened the diary numbered 1. The handwriting was Walter's, younger than she ever remembered it, tighter and more careful, the hand of a man in his 20s rather than the looser scrawl she'd known for the last 2 decades of his life. The first entry was dated nearly 31 years earlier. It described, in plain and unembellished language, the rescue of a single draft horse from an auction lot outside Lexington, an animal too old and too lame to be of use to the industrial farm that had discarded it, bound for a fate Walter did not write down in detail, though the omission itself said enough. She turned pages with fingers that had gone cold despite the July heat pressing down through the open hatch above her. Entry after entry described more of the same. Horses acquired quietly, sometimes purchased outright, sometimes simply taken in when no one else would claim them, brought here, to this land, to be fed and healed, and, in most cases, kept for the rest of their lives in the pastures she had walked across for 38 years without ever knowing what they had witnessed. Walter had never spoken of a rescue. He had never once, in nearly 4 decades of marriage, mentioned that this was what the extra grain orders were for, what the late nights in the barn were about, what the unexplained trips to auction houses 2 counties over had actually accomplished. She found his handwriting, 3 diaries in, finally slow into something less like record-keeping and more like confession. Told her again today, I was checking fence line. She believes me because she has no reason not to. I don't know how to explain this without her thinking less of the money we don't have. Easier to keep it separate. Easier to let her think I'm just bad with numbers. Jeanette read the line twice, then a third time, the flashlight beam trembling slightly against the page. She sat with that line longer than she meant to, the flashlight beam drifting down to illuminate nothing in particular, a small circle of dirt floor between her boots. There was no anger in her yet, not fully, not in that first hour. Anger would arrive later, in smaller doses, at odd times, folding laundry, driving past the feed store, standing at the sink at midnight. What arrived first was something closer to vertigo, the specific disorientation of discovering a room inside a house you believed you had memorized completely. Above her, through the broken floor, Old Glory's shadow crossed the shaft of light falling into the hidden room. the old horse pacing near the opening with the restless attention of an animal that understood, in whatever way horses understand these things, that something significant had shifted in the world above his head. She did not hear the truck pull into the drive. She did not notice the second set of footsteps crossing the gravel toward the house, then pausing, then redirecting toward the open barn door, until a voice called out from above, pleasant and practiced in the particular tone of a man who has learned to sound sympathetic for a living. "Jeanette, you home?" She froze in the dirt beneath her own barn floor, 30 diaries scattered around her, a secret 30 years in the making pressed open in her lap, and above her, coming closer, the unmistakable footsteps of Sterling Vance. The truck's engine cut off outside, replaced by the crunch of boots on gravel, unhurried, deliberate, a rhythm Jeanette had come to recognize over 15 years of dealing with the man attached to it. She scrambled to pull herself the rest of the way up out of the hidden room, catching the hem of Walter's jacket on a splintered edge of flooring, cursing under her breath in a way she rarely allowed herself anymore. Sterling Vance had a way of standing in a doorway that made it look accidental, though nothing about Sterling Vance was ever accidental. He was 54, silver at the temples in a way that photographed well, dressed today in a pressed short-sleeve shirt too clean for a 4th of July visit to a working farm, a manila folder tucked under one arm like a man who had come prepared for a conversation he intended to control from the first word. Jeanette climbed up out of the hidden room slower than she wanted to, brushing dirt from Walter's old jacket, aware of the exposed hatch behind her and the scattered diaries she had not had time to hide, close, or even fully process. Vance's eyes moved past her face and down to the hole in the floor before she had finished standing, a flicker there, quick and assessing, the look of a man doing arithmetic in real time. He recovered fast. He always did. "Didn't mean to intrude," he said, gesturing loosely toward the open barn door as though he hadn't let himself walk straight through it. "Saw your truck. Figured today of all days, somebody ought to check in on you." Jeanette said nothing for a moment, letting the silence do what silence does, forcing him to fill it if he wanted to keep talking. It was a habit Walter had taught her without meaning to, 38 years of watching him negotiate feed prices with men exactly like this one. Vance's eyes drifted again to the hole in the floor, to the corner of a leather-bound diary just visible at the edge of the opening. "Renovating," he said. "Found something," she said, and offered nothing further. He let it sit a moment, then nodded slowly, the folder under his arm shifting as he adjusted his weight, a tell she filed away without deciding yet what it meant. He talked instead about the anniversary, about how hard these dates could be, about how Walter had been a good man, words that arrived smooth and rehearsed and entirely too fast for a man who claimed to have driven out on impulse. Jeanette watched his mouth move and thought, not for the first time, that Sterling Vance had never once in the 15 years she'd known him said a sentence that didn't have a second purpose folded inside it. The second purpose arrived a few minutes later, delivered with the same practiced gentleness. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the bank had asked him, given his relationship with the family and his standing in the county, to come out ahead of tomorrow's scheduled inspection. "Routine," he said, just confirming the property's condition before the foreclosure proceeding moved forward in the morning. The word landed exactly where he meant it to land. Jeanette had known the date was coming. She had not known it was tomorrow. The letter from the bank 3 weeks ago had said 30 days, and she had done the math more than once, certain she had a little more room to breathe than this. Vance's expression as he watched her absorb the number suggested he had known precisely how much that miscalculation would cost her, and had chosen this morning, this particular grief-heavy morning, to deliver it in person rather than by mail. She did not give him the reaction he was waiting for. Instead, she gathered an armful of the diaries from the hole in the floor, more instinct than decision, and carried them out into the daylight, laying them across the porch railing to dry in air that didn't smell like rot and rust, because some part of her, even in that first disoriented hour, understood these books needed to survive the day more than she needed to hide them from a man who was clearly already too curious about what they contained. Vance followed her out onto the porch under the excuse of continuing the conversation about tomorrow's inspection, and it was there, arranging paperwork he had not been asked to bring, that his eyes caught fully on the diaries laid out across the railing, on the photographs spilling from an open box beside them, on names and dates written in handwriting he clearly recognized. Something changed in his face. Small, controlled, but there. He picked up one photograph before she could stop him, an old image of a bay mare standing in a pasture Jeanette didn't recognize, a name written in the white border in pencil. He looked at it a long moment, turned it over, and set it back down with more care than the gesture required. "Where did all this come from?" he said, and this time his voice had lost some of its practiced ease. Jeanette watched him carefully. "Out from under the barn," she said. "Walter's, apparently. All of it." Vance's silence lasted a beat too long to be casual. He left not long after, folder still under his arm, the foreclosure timeline unchanged. But something in his manner had shifted between the moment he arrived and the moment his truck pulled back out onto the county road. He had come expecting to find a grieving widow he could pressure into a quiet, favorable sale before the auction ever went public. He had left having seen something in those diaries that made him drive slower than usual down the gravel lane, glancing once, twice, in his rearview mirror at the house behind him. Jeanette stood on the porch a long while after the dust from his truck had settled, 38 diaries still buried, a foreclosure now confirmed for the following morning, and a growing, uneasy certainty that whatever her husband had hidden under that barn floor was worth far more to Sterling Vance than the land itself. She went back inside to read. By late afternoon, Jeanette had carried every diary and photograph up from beneath the barn and spread them across the kitchen table in an order that meant nothing to anyone but her, an attempt to make sense of 30 years compressed into an afternoon. The heat had not broken. Somewhere down the county road, someone had already begun setting off early fireworks, sharp cracks in the distance that made Old Glory's ears twitch from his place in the shade outside the kitchen window. She read faster than she should have, skipping ahead, doubling back, piecing together a version of her husband she had shared a bed with for 38 years and somehow never fully known. The kitchen had grown dim around her without her noticing, the sun sliding low enough to throw long amber bars of light across the table, across the scattered pages, across her own hands turning paper that had waited decades to be read by the one person who never knew to look for it. She had stopped, at some point, making any pretense of eating lunch. A glass of water sat untouched by her elbow, sweating a ring onto the wood. The rescues had a name, though Walter had never used it aloud to anyone she could confirm. He called it, in the private language of the diaries, the Circle, a loose, informal network of farmers and horsemen across 3 counties who quietly absorbed the animals that large operations no longer wanted. Plow horses replaced by machinery, carriage horses aged out of city work, breeding stock discarded when a bloodline stopped being profitable. Walter had not built this alone. There were other names threaded through the pages. Men and women Jeanette recognized from church, from the feed store, from funerals over the years, people she had exchanged pleasantries with for decades without ever suspecting the quiet work connecting them. What stopped her, 3 diaries and 2 hours deep into the afternoon, was a folded document tucked between the pages of the 12th volume, brittle with age, dated 1961. It was a land deed. Her hands went still over the paper as she read it a second time, then a third, checking the names against what little she knew of the county's history. The document recorded a formal transfer of 11 acres, the northeast corner of the property, the very land the barn stood on, from a man named Elias Vance to the sanctuary operation Walter's diaries referred to only as the Circle, dated decades before Walter himself had ever owned a single acre of this farm. Elias Vance, Sterling's grandfather. The implications took a moment to fully arrive, the way a shift in weather sometimes announces itself only after the sky has already changed. If this deed was legitimate, if it had never been properly voided or reabsorbed into later transactions, then a portion of the very land now under threat of foreclosure had never legally belonged to whatever financial structure the current mortgage was built on top of. It had been given away, freely, by Sterling Vance's own grandfather, 65 years before his grandson arrived on the porch with a folder full of foreclosure paperwork. The fireworks outside grew a little louder as the evening approached, and Jeanette sat at her kitchen table with a document that might unmake the debt hanging over her head, entirely uncertain what to do with it, entirely certain that whatever she chose next would not be simple. Sterling Vance returned just after 7, without calling first, his truck kicking up gravel dust in a way that suggested less patience than his morning visit had shown. He came up the porch steps two at a time, and when Jeanette opened the door, the practiced warmth from earlier had been replaced with something closer to urgency, poorly concealed behind a smile that didn't reach far enough up his face. He had brought a checkbook this time. He set it on the porch railing beside the diaries, still lying where she'd left them to dry. He talked fast, faster than she'd ever heard him talk, laying out an offer with the smooth structure of a man who had rehearsed it in the truck on the drive over. He would clear every debt on the farm by end of week. He would arrange, at his own expense, a comfortable place for her in town, close to the church, close to people her own age, a life without fences to mend or mortgages to fear. All she had to do, he said, voice dropping into something almost gentle, almost kind, was hand over whatever document referenced the old land transfer, and let the rest, the diaries, the rescue records, all 30 years of it, go into a fire before morning. Jeanette looked at him for a long moment, the porch light beginning to draw moths out of the darkening evening. Old Glory's silhouette visible at the edge of the pasture, still watching, still waiting, the way he had waited all year for something that never came back. She asked him, quietly, why it mattered so much to him what happened to a stack of old diaries nobody outside this farm had ever heard of. Vance's jaw tightened. For the first time since she'd known him, he didn't have an answer ready. It was Jeanette, in the silence that followed, who understood something she had not fully let herself consider until that exact moment. This was never only about the land. It was about a name, Vance's name, his family's name, the reputation of a real estate business built across 3 decades on the assumption that the Vance family had always dealt fairly, always built rather than taken. A single deed proving his grandfather had once given land away for compassion's sake, only for his grandson to spend a lifetime clawing pieces of the county back through foreclosure and pressure sales, was not the kind of story Sterling Vance could survive in a town this size. She told him she needed the night to think. He left with the checkbook still in hand, and this time, when his truck pulled away, he did not glance back. Jeanette did not sleep that night, though she lay in the bed she'd shared with Walter for 38 years and stared at the ceiling as though an answer might be written there. She thought of the checkbook on the railing, of a life in town with soft furniture and no debt and no leaking roof, a life that would have asked nothing more of her than to let go of something she had only discovered existed 24 hours earlier. She thought of 30 years of quiet rescue folded into leather bindings under a barn floor, of horses whose names she now knew, whose fates her husband had recorded with more care than he had ever recorded a single household expense. By the time the sun came up on the morning of July 5th, she had made her decision, though the county's Independence Day celebration technically ran through the evening of the 4th into a full second day of festivities at the town square, a tradition older than most of the families who attended it. She loaded 31 of the diaries into the bed of her truck, the ones she'd had time to read enough of to know what they held, along with 2 boxes of photographs and the folded 1961 deed, now sealed carefully in a plastic sleeve she'd found in Walter's old desk. She did not call ahead. She did not ask permission. She drove into town with the windows down and the heat already rising off the asphalt, past bunting strung along Main Street, past families setting up lawn chairs for the evening's fireworks display, and parked as close to the county square as she could manage. The Historical Society had a small table set up near the gazebo, as they did every year, manned by a retired schoolteacher named Doris Fenwick, who had spent decades trying to get people interested in the county's fading agricultural past. Jeanette walked straight to that table with an armful of diaries and did not stop to explain herself before she started laying them out. Word moves fast in a town small enough that everyone already knows everyone's business. Within 20 minutes, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by curiosity, by the sight of a grieving widow they all knew standing at a folding table with dozens of old books and a stack of photographs, speaking in a voice that had gone rough with a full night of no sleep and 30 years of discovered truth. Children wove between the legs of the adults, uninterested in the papers but drawn by the gathering itself, the way children are always drawn to a crowd that has stopped moving. Somewhere behind the gazebo, a local band that had been rehearsing for the evening's performance let their instruments fall silent one by one as members drifted toward the folding table instead, drawn by whatever current was pulling everyone else. Doris Fenwick stood at Jeanette's elbow the entire time, saying almost nothing, her hands pressed flat against the table's edge as though she needed something solid to hold on to while the county's history rearranged itself in front of her. She read aloud. Not the whole thing. There wasn't time, and some pages felt too private even now to share, but enough. She read the entry about the first horse, rescued from an auction lot outside Lexington 3 decades earlier. She read a name and a date, and watched an elderly man near the front of the gathered crowd go pale and step forward, asking her to repeat it, because the horse she had just described, down to the white marking on its left hind leg, had been the plow horse his family lost to a machinery buyout when he was 9 years old, a horse he had cried over for a week and never seen again. It was not the only recognition. A woman in her 40s recognized a mare's name from her own grandmother's stories. A man who ran the hardware store on 5th Street went quiet, then walked away from the crowd for several minutes. Returning with red eyes and no explanation, he offered aloud. Piece by piece, name by name, the crowd around Jeanette's folding table began to understand that the quiet, unassuming farmer they had buried a year ago had spent 30 years secretly absorbing a piece of grief that belonged, in some fractional way, to nearly every family in the county. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered the way a crowd cheers for a parade or a fireworks display. Instead, a stillness settled over the square that felt older and heavier than applause, the particular silence of a community realizing it had misjudged its own history, that the quiet man who never said much at church suppers had been carrying more weight and more mercy than any of them had thought to ask about while he was alive to answer. Sterling Vance arrived roughly 40 minutes in, drawn by the same rumors spreading through the crowd, and pushed his way toward the front with the particular urgency of a man watching a controlled situation slip entirely out of his hands. He reached the table as Jeanette was lifting the sealed plastic sleeve holding the 1961 deed, and for a moment, the two of them stood facing each other across a folding table while half the town watched. He said her name, low, a warning disguised as a plea. She did not lower the document. She read it aloud instead, the full text, the names, the date, the 11 acres given freely by a man named Elias Vance to a sanctuary his own grandson had spent years trying to erase the memory of. The crowd's reaction rippled outward in real time. Confusion first, then a low murmur of recognition as older residents placed the Vance family name against decades of foreclosures and land acquisitions that suddenly read very differently in this new light. Vance did not deny it. He could not. Not with the original document held up in front of a crowd this size. Not with Doris Fenwick already reaching for her phone to photograph every page for the Historical Society's records. He stood very still, the folder from the previous morning nowhere in sight. And for the first time since Jeanette had known him, Sterling Vance looked like a man who had run out of moves. He turned and walked away from the square without another word, and nobody stopped him, and nobody called after him, because by then every eye in the crowd had already turned back to the widow standing behind the folding table, and to the sound, rising faintly from the direction of the parking lot, of hooves against pavement. Old Glory had followed the truck. Nobody quite agreed afterward on how the old Clydesdale had managed it, whether a neighbor had trailered him in without telling anyone, whether he'd been loose in the pasture and simply followed the scent of the truck down the county road for the better part of 2 miles, favoring his bad leg the entire way. What mattered, in the moment, was that the crowd gathered around the folding table turned as one to see an aging draft horse walking slowly, deliberately, into the center of the county square, past the gazebo, past the bunting, past children who had never seen an animal that size up close. His gait uneven, but his head high in a way none of the neighbors who remembered him from the old parade days had seen in years. He stopped a few feet from Jeanette and stood there, breathing hard, sweat darkening his neck from the effort, and the crowd around them went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with confusion anymore. Jeanette walked to him slowly, laid a hand against his shoulder, and for the first time since the anniversary of Walter's death had begun that morning, allowed herself to stand still in front of an entire town without trying to hold anything together. The Historical Society took formal custody of the diaries that same evening, photographing every page before returning the originals to Jeanette's care, and Doris Fenwick, who had spent 30 years failing to interest anyone in the county's agricultural history, found herself fielding calls from a regional newspaper before the fireworks over the square had even finished. The foreclosure did not disappear overnight. Jeanette understood, standing in the square with the deed still in her hand, that a document this old would need to survive a court's scrutiny before it meant anything legally binding. That the bank's proceedings scheduled for the following morning would not simply halt themselves because a crowd of neighbors had gathered to listen to old diary entries. She drove home that night without any certainty that the farm would still belong to her by the end of the month, only a growing, unfamiliar sense that she was no longer facing that uncertainty alone. She was right to worry. The bank's representative arrived as scheduled the next morning, paperwork in hand, unmoved by a story he'd only heard secondhand through a phone call the night before, and it took 3 additional weeks, a county attorney working at a reduced rate after hearing the story secondhand, and a judge willing to grant an emergency stay pending review of the 1961 deed's validity before the foreclosure was formally suspended. Jeanette spent those 3 weeks doing the only thing she knew how to do with uncertainty. She fed the horses, mended what fence she could afford to mend, and waited. The waiting was its own kind of labor. There were nights she woke at 3 in the morning convinced the entire day at the square had been some fevered invention of grief that she would find, come daylight, the diaries gone, and the foreclosure notice still sitting unopened on the kitchen table exactly as it always had. She kept the sealed plastic sleeve holding the deed in the drawer beside her bed rather than trust it to any other room in the house, checking it some nights the way a person checks a stove they are almost certain they turned off. Support came in smaller, stranger shapes than she expected. A stranger from 2 counties over left $100 in an envelope taped to her mailbox with no return address. A note inside reading only that her grandfather's plow horse had died happy because of a man named Walter Colby. The hardware store owner extended her credit without being asked. Doris Fenwick called twice a week with updates on the deed's progress through the county records office, her voice each time a little steadier, a little more certain that the paperwork would hold. Sterling Vance did not return to the farm again. He sold his real estate holdings in the county within the year, quietly, without public explanation, though most of Merrow's Creek understood well enough by then not to need one spoken aloud. The deed was upheld in county court that autumn. The 11 acres formally reclassified as protected land, the remaining mortgage renegotiated with the help of a historical society fundraising effort that drew donations from farms across 3 counties. Families who had spent a summer evening in the town square discovering they owed a debt of their own to a man they'd never known was watching over something so quietly for so long. Jeanette Colby did not become a wealthy woman. The farm remained a working operation, modest and imperfect, its fences still needing paint, its barn roof still needing repair. But it remained hers, and it remained, for the first time in decades, exactly what her husband had always meant it to be. By the following spring, a hand-painted sign hung at the edge of the property, near the gate that had once needed no explanation and now welcomed a slow but steady trickle of visitors, descendants of families whose horses had passed through the circle decades earlier. Historians researching the informal rescue network that had operated across 3 counties without ever once seeking recognition, and occasionally, a stranger who had simply read about the widow and the barn and wanted to see the place for themselves. Jeanette gave tours some Saturdays, though she never called them that. She walked visitors through the pastures, told them what she knew of the horses buried there over the decades, pointed out Old Glory grazing in his usual spot beneath the oak tree, still favoring the bad leg, still watching the road with the same patient attention he'd carried all his life. She did not pretend the grief had resolved itself into something clean. There were still mornings she reached for a second coffee cup out of habit before remembering. There were still nights the house felt too large for one person to occupy. The debt was managed now, not erased. A working farm carrying a working farm's ordinary burdens. No miracle beyond the one that had already happened. What had changed was quieter than a miracle, and in some ways more permanent. She no longer carried the particular shame that had sat behind her ribs for a year, the belief that her husband had died knowing he'd failed her, that his silence about the farm's collapsing finances had been a kind of abandonment she would spend the rest of her life trying to forgive. She understood now that Walter had been carrying something else entirely, a second life's worth of quiet devotion he had never known how to explain without feeling it would diminish in the telling. He had not hidden failure under that barn floor. He had hidden 30 years of a compassion so private he had never once let himself take credit for it, not even to the woman who shared his bed for nearly 4 decades. She kept the diaries in the house now, not the barn, arranged on a shelf Walter had built with his own hands decades earlier for a purpose she had never fully appreciated until now. She had not read every page. She suspected she never would, not entirely, and had come to understand that this, too, was part of what he'd left her, not an ending, but an ongoing thing, a story with no final page, still being written every time a new name arrived at the gate asking about a horse someone in their family had once loved and lost. Doris Fenwick, true to her word, secured a modest grant the following spring to formally catalog the diaries for the county archive, and on quiet Tuesday afternoons Jeanette sometimes sat across the table from her, sleeves rolled, reading entries aloud while the retired schoolteacher typed them into a record that would outlast them both. It was slow work. Neither of them minded. There was a particular comfort in it, in watching 30 years of a stranger's quiet compassion finally take a shape that other people could hold, could pass down, could point to and say, "This happened here, in this county," because one man decided that a discarded animal's life still mattered enough to protect in secret. The farm never became what it once was in Walter's grandfather's day, sprawling and prosperous, written up in agricultural bulletins for its bloodlines and its breeding stock. It became something smaller and, in its own way, more honest, a working sanctuary with 11 protected acres at its heart, a handful of horses grazing pastures that would never again be threatened by a bank's calendar, and a widow who had stopped waking each morning bracing herself for a loss that had, in truth, already happened and could not happen twice. Old Glory lived another 18 months after that 4th of July, longer than the vet had quietly predicted, long enough to stand once more in the county parade the following summer, mane braided, hooves polished, drawing the same gasps from children he'd drawn for over a decade before his body began to fail him. When he finally passed, in his sleep, in the shade of the same oak tree he'd spent his last years beneath, Jeanette buried him on the 11 acres her husband had spent 30 years protecting, in land that would never again belong to anyone but the animals it had always been meant for. She still walks that pasture some evenings, when the light goes gold and the fences cast long shadows across ground her husband loved in ways he never fully knew how to say aloud. The barn stands repaired now, its floor solid, its secret long since brought into the light. What remains buried there is smaller and quieter and belongs to no one but her. The understanding that a life well lived does not always announce itself, that some of the truest legacies a person leaves behind are the ones they never thought to mention, and that on one particular 4th of July, in a county that nearly forgot to look, the ground itself finally told the truth a good man had been too humble to speak.